So they really had not much of an option. By the next day, by the 8th of April, King Zog and his government completely disappeared and collapsed as the Italian forces entered Tirana, and the Albanian garrison in Tirana already deposited its weapons in the garden of the Italian legation, um, surrendering, and the Italian motorcyclists, followed by some small tank units, rode into the city square at around 10:30 a.m. The streets were mostly empty, and the government buildings were abandoned except for just a few minor officials and doorkeepers. Um, the Albanian government surrendered, and thus within just 36 hours of the landing, Italy had secured Albania not only militarily but politically. And this speed of the Albanian collapse underscored the futility of King Zog's last maneuvers and the structural weaknesses of the Albanian state, being um, so small and unpowerful as it was. And though individual acts of courage had taken place, of course, with the fighting in Durrës, um, as well as in Flor, the government as an institution had was in no position to organize or inspire resistance on a national scale. The Albanian state ceased to function, and what remained was just a power vacuum that the Italian forces were quick to fill, and they worked to consolidate their control over Albania and integrate it into Mussolini's vision of a fascist empire in the east side of the Adriatic in the Balkans. So, on April 8th, following the rapid disintegration of the Albanian government, um, there and collapse of further resistance, what followed was swift consolidation of power by the Italian regime, um, in both politically and administratively. And beneath this surface of Italian occupation, the Italian authorities encouraged a mixture of some passive hostility almost. Passive hostility, reluctant collaboration, and or isolated acts of defiance, though, from segments of the Albanian population. And Count Ciano, whose personal obsession with Albania, as we've seen earlier, had in many ways driven this entire campaign. And he arrived in Tirana shortly after the Italian troops, and his expectations, shaped by highly optimistic reports from Italian agents prior to the invasion, was that he would be greeted as a liberator. But instead, he found the city marked in silence and suspicion. Um, and Counciano was met at the airfield by General Guzzoni and the Air Force General Giuseppe Valle, and he was also met with Francesco Giacomoni, the Italian minister to Albania, who never had been evacuated, which was a sign of Rome's confidence that the invasion would proceed without major disruption. They knew it would just succeed in a couple of days. And accompanied by the Albanian officials who chose to remain behind, including General Zef Sereci and Xafer Beyibi, Counciano proceeded to the city hall in Albania, in which a small and unenthusiastic crowd was gathered to see Counciano, and among the few to address the public was Vissarion, the former archbishop of the Albanian Orthodox Church, um, who was previously dismissed by King Zog for misconduct. And Vissarion gave a perfunctory speech that urged Albanians to cooperate with the Italians, but his remarks were coldly received by the Albanian public. They did not like it. And despite the Albanian propaganda asserting the Italian people, that the Italian people were welcoming the Italian rule, in reality, and as well as in Counciano's own diary, it noted that it was definitely not the case. Counciano's diary noted that high school students in Tirana refused to give the Roman salute, And he wrote, quote, "I see the eyes of some patriots flaming with anger," he wrote, "and tears running down their faces." So there are definitely some um, emotional resistance within many Albanians who did not want to be subjugated by the Italians. This quiet but unmistakable resistance reflected widespread Albanian resentment towards the occupation, despite the Italian government's propaganda to say otherwise. And that said, not all Albanians would oppose the Italians, and a notable minority actually chose collaboration either out of opportunism or even genuine alignment with fascist ideology. Examples ranging from minor figures to senior officials. Marco Corelli, the ex-prefect of Durrës, had fled to Bari on the 6th of April to broadcast his pro-Italian messages condemning King Zog. And Corelli returned to Albania immediately after the invasion and resumed his position under the new administration. And General Zev Sereci, who was one of King Zog's closest aides, resigned his post as the Albanian minister to Rome just before the invasion and returned to Albania alongside Count Ciano and was promised a leading role in the Italian puppets regime. So these were some high-profile collaborationist cases, but also many, of course, ordinary Albanians sought profit from this regime, including one example noted by the British minister Sir Andrew Ryan, in which a tailor in Durrës was seen sewing Italian flags from calico on the day Italian troops marched in. And this kind of behavior, which was, though not widespread, highlighted how swiftly some individuals within Albanian society adapted to the changed political landscape without shedding a tear. And yet there were individual acts of courage and defiance. Abbas Kupi, who led the defense at Durrës, did not surrender after the city fell, and instead he retreated into the hills of the countryside and he began organizing guerrilla resistance. And although this movement was initially very small and poorly organized and limited, it represented one of the first organized Albanian resistances against the Italian occupation. And similarly, former Prime Minister Mehdi Bey Frasheri refused to cooperate with Italy, and he made public statements condemning the invasion and addressed a remonstrance to Mussolini himself and sought refuge in the Turkish legation. And despite assurances from the German minister that Frasheri would not be harmed, he was eventually arrested by the Italian authorities and was interned in Italy. And despite these, you can call them exceptions, the change did not reflect the broad reality within Albanian society. Albania had ceased to function as an independent state, and Italian administrators moved quickly to formalize their control, and Italian troops occupied key infrastructures. Roads, railways, airfields, and government ministries. Italian flags were raised, and Italian military law was imposed. The old Albanian state apparatus was dismantled and absorbed into the new structure. Albanian laws were amended to mirror Italian fascist laws, including establishment of fascist youth organizations and labor syndicates. One of Mussolini's main objectives was to present the occupation as legitimate and consensual, of course. And to this end, the Italian authorities engineered a public ceremony offering the Albanian crown to King Victor Emmanuel III. This act mirrored earlier fascist strategies in Ethiopia to attempt to create some sort of facade of constitutional legality to this annexation. And the Albanian parliament, which was by then just reduced to a rump body composed of collaborators, they formally ratified this offer under Italian supervision, though it was definitely not legitimate. And yet, despite these efforts, genuine popular support for the Italian regime was always going to be limited, And unlike in Austria following the Anschluss or even the Sudetenland, there was no mass outpouring of Albanian enthusiasm because Albanians viewed this occupation as another chapter in their long history of foreign domination rather than as a national realignment. And the Italian efforts to cultivate local support through propaganda, economic incentives, and public works projects achieved only partial success. So, there were some collaborators and some resistances, but overall, um, the Italian government had full control over the Albanian matters, um, but the public was not for it. So, in some, while the Italian consolidation over Albania after invasion was efficient administratively, it definitely did not capture the hearts of the Albanian people. And beneath the surface rest a calm imposed by Italian troops. There were resentment among the Albanian people, and this resentment would, in time, give rise to broader resistance movements, especially in the countryside, and first fragmented and tribal, but later coalescing into an organized partisan struggle that defined the Albanian wartime experience under both Albanian occupation and later in German occupation.